Okay, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this Wheaton conversation with Amy Lemaire and Gordon Smith. I'm Pamela Weichman. Many of you may already know me. I am your host tonight, as well as the Director of Education at WheatonArts. I'm a white female in my 30s with long brown hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing a blue t-shirt. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm broadcasting from Southern New Jersey, which I recognize as traditionally the land of the Lenni Lenape. I will be monitoring your chat throughout the program for your technical and general questions. Links to additional resources will also be posted in the chat throughout the program. If you would like to pose a question to our speakers, please do so within the Q&A feature. Should you lose connection for any reason, please close all of your windows, then click on your original email link to join again. We'd like to thank our sponsors, PNC Arts Alive and the Art Alliance for Contemporary Glass, for their support of this program. Through membership, donations, and shopping at shopwheatonarts.org, you can show your support. Please consider exploring these options so we can continue to offer free programs like this. It is my pleasure to introduce my co-host for this program, Alexander Rosenberg. Alex is a Philadelphia-based artist, educator, and writer. He earned a Master of Science in Visual Arts from MIT and a BFA in Glass from Rhode Island School of Design. He was cast on the Netflix series Blown Away in 2018 while teaching at Salem Community College and is now the Glass Studio Director at WheatonArts. Alex, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Pam. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm so pleased to have Amy and Gordon speaking tonight. I'll start. Let's advance to the next slide, and I'll tell you a little bit about Amy. Amy has a lot of both of our speakers have a long history of connections to Wheaton, and we also share a connection of Salem Community College. So that's kind of what I'm going to focus on. Amy has degrees from SAIC and Pratt. She was also a Wheaton Fellow. I just learned that she set up the first, the flame working area that we now like to use in the studio. And her work's currently on view at the Delaware Contemporary in a show called Through a Glass Darkly that I co-curated. Super excited to have her. Gordon also is part of the kind of SCC greater orbit, has a degree in scientific glass technology and grew up kind of around South Jersey glass industry. But I understand that he kind of learned offhand glass blowing while volunteering at Wheaton. So I'm very pleased to introduce the two of them. Please welcome them. And I'll pass it on to Amy.
All right. Thank you, Alex. And welcome, Gordon. Thanks, Pam, for introducing us. And I'm just going to go ahead and pop up some images here on the screen. Let's do that. Okay. All right. So tonight we're going to take a look at some of the work that Gordon Smith has made and his journey in glass, and then we'll look at a little bit of my work in there too, and maybe kind of have a little bit of a conversation about how our journeys have overlapped in a lot of different ways. And so I would like to start out by asking Gordon, first, hello, and how did you get into glass?
Real quick, thanks very much for having me. I appreciate the invite to have a conversation. My journey began with my father mentioning that there's a glass form called scientific glass blowing, or there's a type of glass called that. I had known of hot glass from visiting Wheaton Village with my family, but my dad said, hey, there's this other kind of glass work being done, and would you like to see it? And he found out where I could go see it. And lucky for me, Salem College was only about 35 minutes from the home I was, where I grew up. So I went and saw it there, and that kind of hooked me just from walking in the room and seeing it being done by the students. And I think I was 14 or 15 when he took me to the school to see it.
Wow. And so you went to Salem, and then you went to go work in the scientific glassblowing industry and had a
Yeah.
career there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about what we're looking at on the screen here?
On
Some
the
of your professional work.
Yeah, this was well into my career. This isn't something that right out of the gate you're probably going to have a job having to fabricate something like this. But on the left there, you can see it's a pretty complicated. It's called a separator, and it's hard to tell. This actually gets a magnetic device hooked to the left side there, because there's a bucket that hangs on the inside of that bigger tube, and it moves. The magnet causes that dark area there, which is a piece of stainless steel, or excuse me, cast, that's been sealed in a small tube. The magnet would actually cause that bucket to swing. That's why it's called a swinging bucket divider. And gases and fluids pass through that and either go into one cavity or another cavity, which you can see there. There's tubes coming off on the side and going out the bottom. But that's a typical type of piece of apparatus that you would fabricate, all done by hand. You work with a blueprint.
Wow.
You might have a machine holding something, but for the most part, you're hand fabricating, shaping and forming everything just offhand on a torch. On the right side, that was a commission piece for an airplane company that made a coating that went on their aircrafts to resist lightning bolt shocks. So I made the plasma tube I sculpted the plane, and it's got a coating of pure platinum on it. And then Amy, you can speak to the plasma part of that more than I can, but it had the gases put in so that when you touch the outside tube, all these plasma shocks would hit the plane, and it was used as a marketing device at a trade show.
That's very cool. So it sounds like you're in your scientific career, you work with a range of clients, ranging from like research and then also to like sort of some prototyping and other types of more design clients as well.
Yeah. There was the company mainly did laboratory glassware, but because we did large work that not a lot of companies did, we would get jobs like this, these oddball forms of, that people needed that they couldn't get done anywhere else. And lucky for me, I enjoyed doing that. I wasn't strictly scientific glass. I was up for doing anything creative like that. So it worked for the company. It worked for me too, to be able to make these things.
Well, that's a whole other skill set too. I mean, it's one skill set to be able to make glass in the service of researchers, right, in research, but then also to have some sort of an artistic sensibility and be able to do more artistic projects for clients or for yourself as well is almost like a different additional skill set. So that you have both of these and you've done these at a high level is very impressive.
Oh, well, thank you. I think that you kind of develop a way to think about these things almost as if they're, even though one's much more creative, that to me, I treated them the same. I was making something, and I just did what it took to make the form. But there's clearly a much more open palette for creativity with something like the plasma tube.
One thought that I have about these two objects, and the reason why I wanted to kind of start with these two is because in scientific glassblowing, a lot of times, or most of the time, you're not really seeing the glass as part of an end goal, in research, right? The glass, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much invisible, right? It's like a tool that gets used in order to perform the research, and you don't really see these objects very much. But when you're working for a designer with like the piece on the right, then that does become a very visible piece of glass that you would look at. So the scientific apparatus on the left, it's more like you would look through it to whatever was happening on the inside, which is kind of an interesting distinction, which I think will come back around when we consider artwork as well, whether we're looking through the glass as sort of a tool, or whether we're looking at the glass as sort of like an end object.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's take a look at some of the other pieces that you fabricated.
Hmm.
So this is one of my favorite pieces visually, Oldershaw column. And these are two different columns, right? In
Yeah.
these photos.
Mhm.
Yeah. Can you tell us, do you know what these are used for at all?
They're used, gas passes, and I don't know what type of gas, but there's the end game is going gas to a liquid. And these are part of a huge apparatus. Sometimes, for instance, the piece on the right, that got put into a larger piece of apparatus that used scaffolding that was 2 stories tall. So it was a huge setup for this reaction to occur. And it's really the reason for the larger piece is just to get more volume, to get more product. But gases would pass up through the column, through the tiny little holes that you see in the disc. You can't see it in the one on the right, but the one on the left, you can see those little holes in each disc that were ultrasonically drilled through the plate. And then liquid would then drip down through the tube that you see to one side of each disc. It's kind of a tail, looks like a little tail that's been offset. So that's what it was for, was to go from gas to liquid. I don't know exactly what was being made or produced, but normally the one on the left is what you would get an order for to make for a company. The one on the right, that had never been done before that we knew of. No one else would make one. They never had made one that large, and the job came into where I was working, and I saw the drawing and thought, hey, I'd love to try that. I'd never made one even much larger than what's in my hand there on the left, but it worked out. It was a long process. Just to give you an idea, something like that, I worked on that piece for 6.5 hours without stopping. You couldn't, because it would crack if you did, or the chances were pretty great of it cracking. You can see here me working on it, sealing in each disc one at a time and each section of tubing one at a time.
I love these shots. Like, I love process shots of any kind with glass blowing, but I think that this is a pretty remarkable shot because a lot of people think of flame working as being miniature or being small scale or working at the bench, but there's really so many other possibilities, especially when you start getting into the borosilicate glasses. And a lot of these precedents start at the function, for making these large apparatus in the scientific industry, and are just now kind of starting to be explored on a large scale in the art world.
Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in with a quick question, especially maybe for people in the audience that might not be as familiar with scientific glassworking. But Amy kind of mentioned that talking about the first apparatus that we looked at, that it was important that it was glass because it's important to kind of like see what was going on inside of it. But could you, or the two of you, talk a little bit more about why glass is so important for these different components?
Yeah. Well, the reason that glass is used in a lot of research is that it's pretty inert. It doesn't contaminate at all. So it was determined to be kind of the perfect material for making things, especially in the drug world, where you can't have contamination. Things have to be pure. Whatever you put in has to come out just as pure. And glass was determined to be the perfect material for that. And also, you can see what's going on. You can see the reactions that are going on, which scientists and researchers need to see. But interestingly enough, that first piece that I talked about that had the swinging bucket, before that goes out to a customer, that's a case where you don't get to see everything that's going on because it gets silvered on the inside so that it has a mirrored finish other than one little strip that's left unmirrored so that the researcher can look through and see one little part of what's going on. So it's, you have both, you kind of have the best of both worlds there.
Very cool. Well, being able to work glass to this complexity, to the best of my understanding, like changed the way that science was performed, right? The sciences were performed because it basically enables the extension of the senses, right? As humans, so we're able to see more and to experience more through these apparatus than we would be able to just with the limits of our, our human senses. And then everything that we learn from the research being performed gets fed into what we know about the world. So I like to think that glass helps us expand our perception of the world by the way it functions.
Mm-hmm.
And to that end, I wanted to share with you a couple of my pieces that are not examples of scientific glass blowing, but take their cues from some of the themes that we just talked about. So this piece is called Future Hub, and it's a digital image that was made with a hand-blown lens that clips onto my camera phone, and I make images through it. And so for me, I really latch on to this idea that glass really has the capacity to expand the way we experience the world, expand our perception. And also the glass here, I would consider this to be a glass adjacent piece of artwork, but you don't see the glass. So, but you have to go through the glass in order to get to the image. And so for those reasons, I think that the way I'm using glass here is it can be considered kind of similar to how one would use an apparatus. Where it's sort of invisible. And here,
Oh, I want to about your last piece real quickly. I would assume that the lens that you put on your camera was not flat.
No.
Okay.
So this particular lens was blown into a bowl of frozen peas, and so I make these lenses. The lenses a lot of times have to do with places or experiences, and a lot of times I use found objects, frozen peas, for example. When I blow the glass into the frozen peas, what happens is the glass stiffens up where it touches the frozen bits, and then I can blow the glass out around it, and so the effect is it produces these little lenses, but they're very organic. So I like to improvise as I'm working, and that gives me kind of this element of surprise as I'm going. So this piece is in Through a Glass Darkly. Shameless plug for Through a Glass Darkly, up right now at the Delaware Contemporary that Alex co-curated. And this piece is paired with a large borosilicate sculpture. So in the same way that, Gordon, you're working on the lathe and kind of pushing the boundaries of scale with these apparatus, I like to think that I'm kind of participating in the same sort of exercise in the studio when I'm sculpting. And I'm really taking my cues from the scientific glassblowers and using some of those same tools and ring stands and hand torches to make pieces that are much larger than you would be able to make on a bench.
Mm-hmm.
So while these are not coming from the tradition of scientific glassblowing, without knowledge of all of those traditions, I would not be able to make these pieces. So I think they're connected that way.
But what's interesting is that you're part of the group of people that thought outside the bench, so to speak. We didn't really think that, you can only make it so big. Right. And see these very large images, just, the way you described working with the tools, and you could have filled the room. And it's cool to see that we're just so out of the box with size and flame working. So.
Well, that's the thing, considering glass is a sculptural material, and especially borosilicate coming from a flame working tradition, you're really only limited by the size of the kiln, and you can even get around that. So I think artists are are really just starting to push the limits of the way this material can be used in a plastic situation, you know, to sculpt wood. So I'm really excited for the future to see where that goes.
Yeah, it's cool.
All right, so let's look at let's kind of switch gears a little bit and look at some of your art practice here, and move into these beautiful paperweights that you make. And I was wondering, just to kind of cross over, I'm wondering, how has your vocation as a scientific glassblower influenced your artistic process, or has it influenced your artistic process?
Yeah, it had a huge influence, and it's something that anybody that ever asks me about if they want to be a paperweight maker or a glass artist doing anything, I recommend that they go to Salem and learn laboratory glass blowing, and then go to work in a factory setting like I did, and you do repetition, and you do. I mean, I learned to do a lot of the same thing over and over again. I would work a week or two on the same pieces of apparatus, and what I learned looking back is that it made it so that, I mean, looking at this paperweight, there's a lot of repetition you see in there with all the components that make up this paperweight, especially on the scaling of the snake. I believe that having that foundation of repetition and a refined way of doing things that you learn in laboratory glass blowing, I'm not a believer in that quote, technique is cheap. Unless it's just technique, then I think it doesn't get you far. But I think all the great artwork in the world, if you look at it, I don't care what the medium is, it has a really, really sound foundation of good techniques and being able to reproduce what you're doing. And so that, you know, that's where the laboratory glass blowing for me clearly helped me become a better glass artist, and you know, making small sculpture like the paperweights.
Well, let's look at a few more in a little detail here. And the details are just so exquisite. I noticed that can you tell us a little bit about the imagery that you're choosing to represent?
Yeah. A lot of it's personal taste for me. I mean, I grew up along my parents had a summer home along the beach, so the ocean and all things ocean and aquatic were always close to me, and I always enjoyed them. And another thing about the marine life motifs that I do, glass is such a natural fit for doing these kind of art forms, because it just you think it's water, and it really is a fluid technically. So it lended to these type of motifs. I was a scuba diver at one time, and I just enjoyed that. So I wanted to recreate these underwater environments. The desert scenes it's the same thing. I've lived in the desert. I've always liked desert scenes, and wherever you look around, I'm in Arizona now. When I'm out and about, it's not hard to come up with an idea or a design to work on just because of my environment.
I love the way that you speak about the glass as being kind of related to water in these pieces. And that's something kind of striking, because a lot of the like kind of more traditional motifs of paperweights that I've seen, there's a lot of botanicals and, you know, insects and stuff like that. And in those pieces, I think that the glass acts more as sort of like a magnifying lens, of course, but then also it almost kind of disappears, like you're looking through the glass. And in yours, you're looking through the glass, but you're also looking at the glass and sort of like acknowledging the fact that mass of glass exists, and likening it to a liquid, which it was in the forming process, which I think is really kind of nice.
Yeah.
Gordon, I hope I'm not getting ahead of you here, but can you tell us chronologically a little bit, like, is this work happening while you're working in scientific industry, or like, you know, how do those two kind of influence one another?
I worked in strictly scientific from 1978 until 1980. And by grand design or pure coincidence, I went to work for the Qantas Glass Company. And I then became familiar with paperweights through the owners of the company who made flamework paperweights as a hobby. And I then started to experiment. And that's when I made somewhat of a crossover. And then I was full-time just paperweights for many years, and then went back to doing both for many years. So I always said that I have a dual profession, and because for a 10-year period, I was doing both full-time.
Can you see any of like what you were doing concurrently in industry? Like you look at this and be like, oh, I was working on this 200-liter flask, and I remember it as I was making those tiny little details.
Yeah. Yeah, I can. I think of it every day.
It's interesting is I fabricate and make art as well, and what I find in the relationship between those two is usually there's some kind of opposition. Like if I'm working really large, doing a very repetitive fabricated piece for somebody, then in my own artwork it kind of compensates by usually shifting in the opposite scale and becoming sort of like and wanting to improvise more. If my whatever I'm doing for my day job is very rigid, I want the opposite in my own practice. And somehow between the two, like a balance gets struck. That's like satisfying to me as a human.
I have found that same thing. I found it refreshing to go to, I actually found it refreshing when somebody handed me a blueprint and said, here's what I need to have made. I didn't have to be creative other than just the fabrication of it, however I did it. I wasn't having to invent the object. And I did find that refreshing at times, and it did make for, in my own studio, a much more refreshing space when I went back to that. It was interesting how I can still do it. I just hit the switch, one versus the other. And I always think of each one as I'm doing the other. They're never far away from each other.
There's so much detail in these. And can you tell us about these are some of your sources of inspiration here?
Yeah. The snake on the left there, that was made in the 1800s, and it's about based on the photo, it's pretty large. It's about the diameter of one of your fingers, maybe even a little larger. And I don't know how long. It amazes me that it was even made in that time, because flame working was so primitive back then that this cane had been pulled and then cut through. So it was an overlay of different colors and then cut through. That's why you see what appears to be the scaling on that snake. The reason I included it is that was my inspiration for doing what I do with snakes and lizards and that sort of thing, because that was the extent of it in the 1800s. And my question was, why didn't anybody actually scale a snake or a lizard where there literally were actual scales? And so this inspired me to invent that technique for the work that I do. And so that's a very important piece for me. And on the,
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the Panton factory. Is it American?
No, it's a
European?
French factory.
Okay.
The Panton factory in France. On the right-hand side, that's an example of a lot of the current work I'm doing. There's a lot of grassy stuff and little mossy growths on things. And I just find this is actually a tree up in Bend, Oregon, where my wife's family has a home. And there's a ton of trees there that grow this lichen-like grass on the trees, and they're everywhere. And I just find it fascinating. And So I use examples like that. This was just taken on a walk we were taking. And it's just a great example of where I get some of some of my thoughts from.
Fabulous. And then here, this is what you were talking about with the scale technology, right? On the left with the snake.
Yeah. You can see they're done one at a time. You have to. There's no quick way to make these. I work for days on just the snake, and they're anywhere from 6 to 9 or 10 inches long. But each scale is made individually and put on individually. And then you can see that I've evolved with the snake eggs. The one on the left there, the baby snake in the egg there, is not scaled, and the ones on the right, I took it to the next level for myself, and I always wanted to have the baby eggs scaled as well. And you can see there that there's a full snake in each one of those eggs that has scales on it as well.
There's something that here that reminds me of this tradition in glass working, to kind of freeze nature, so to speak, I think of the Blashkas, who made replicas for studying the natural world, and this work very much reminds me of that kind of idea where you're sort of freezing time so that you can kind of pause the moment and really extend it, so this does something really interesting time-wise, I think, in relation to how you experience nature, that there are very few materials that can convey that that slowing down of time, I think.
Yeah, I want to, a lot of the environments I do, I want them to be their own little microcosm of what's happening somewhere out there in nature, whether we know it or anybody ever sees it. These things are happening and going on, and to capture these little moments is important when I'm doing the work I'm doing.
And this piece on the left, it looks like there's some of that lichen, maybe that lichen texture in there or something kind of similar.
Yeah.
Wow. Wait, let's see here. These are some more pieces that are prepped up. Right?
They're ready. That's how, before they're put into a paperweight, before they're encased. And at this point, the snake on the left, I might add some of the grass or lichen material. Sometimes I sprinkle it around. I didn't do it here on this one yet, but that's the point at which you would add that to the design, depending on what exactly you're trying to convey. And the one on the strawberries on the right, that design, that's how it sits right before you encase. In fact, that design is about 900 degrees right there. That's why the red on the strawberries appears to be a little dark. That one's actually heated to its temperature where you're just ready to encase it in crystal.
Now, when you encase it in crystal during the next step here, do these setups shift at all?
They can.
Yeah.
They can. Yeah. That's one of the tricks, because it all happens in about 10 seconds. And once it's set, and it's kind of the make it or break it moment. Sometimes things move around, sometimes things break. So you have to just experience and self-knowledge either gets you through or doesn't.
It seems like also that's the moment at which these scenes kind of can come alive too. Which is kind of neat to think about. Yes, it all relies on this one moment where you're sort of giving life to this scene.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then here you've got some dragonflies. That's some pretty intense texture you got going on the wings there.
Yeah. That's actually, I use dichroic glass, which I buy in flat sheets, and I break off small pieces and then shape them to what I want to use them for. And there's also some radicello going on in there. if you look closely. So it's kind of a webbing look.
I love how there's like these little quotes of like glass blowing, like little glass blowing quotes in this natural language, like reticello and the dichroic glass as well. It's like a very much like a glassy material, but then you're using them to render these like very naturalistic scenery. So I like that you're able to blend all of those, like those different types of language together.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And those I'm taking them out of context, really, from what they're mainly used for,
Totally.
to make these dragonflies. They're just not. Yeah, I'm kind of.
Well, that's the right technique for the effect that you're trying to do. And you know, technique is just a tool to make a shape to, you know, express something. So yeah.
I'm so interested in how the encasement produces this like lens that blows up this tiny detail stuff that you've been working on. Is it like I don't know, somehow like hyper real, where you're like focused on these tiny details that are kind of invisible and then become visible? Or like, have you ever got like added the clear glass on the outside and suddenly you're like, oh no, you can see this thing that I thought nobody was going to see, like it's totally ruined?
It can. I mean, sometimes things go wrong, and that's usually if something breaks or a bubble, or if there's an imperfection. You'll see it before you're finished making your design, so you won't continue. It's really if the design were to break in any way, that's when you encase it and you see it, and then in my case, it just stays in the studio. But things are going to move. There's a natural process when you drop 2,500 degrees on a delicate flower. Don't expect it to stay exactly as you had it. Things will move around a little bit. And I know I've learned how that's going to happen. I can't control it completely, but I know how the tip of for instance, the design on the left, I know the tips of the flower petals are going to move a little bit, and that's going to help me create a more natural looking design. So you use it to your advantage.
And when you look really close up at you know, flowers and different natural forms, there's variations. There's so much variation. Like we have this like idea like of a perfect flower, you know, but when you actually look, they're not all perfect. Very few of them are. I used to work as a florist, and when you spend that much time with like plant and botanical matter, you really start to realize like how different every flower is from the next. And so all these little details of the petals curling, those are what make those all unique and kind of give them some sort of sense of being, I think.
Yeah, no, the design on the right there, that cherry blossom design, that's a great example of it, because the way those stamens are made differently than the technique that I use is very different than I use for say the lemon blossom design that had the dragonfly. And this cherry blossom design, it's a much more free-form process. And when the glass hits the flowers, those stamens move around and they do their own thing. And it gives it a very, very natural look. It's not as refined and as tight as other ways you can make them.
Yeah, I really think that's what gives the illusion, you know, that really makes it look realistic.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, and then some of these you make into wearables as well. I see.
Yeah, I collaborated with my wife, Freda. She was a jeweler. She's also a painter, but she spent many years as a jeweler. So she did the designing, and I made the glass pieces, and she designed all the fine silver work, and we came up with these pendants.
Nice. And there's such a historical relationship between gemstones and glass colors too.
Yeah.
that, I think that little touch is nice, the sapphire and the ruby, because to me that like really ties in, like there's an interesting material language thing happening there with those gemstones and with the glass colors,
Yeah.
kind of right in the same piece like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I let Freda do the deciding on that. It was more her, she's great with jewelry, great with stones, and we used all fine stones, rubies, sapphires, and diamonds, set in gold. And yeah, she did some beautiful matchups here.
Yeah, those are really stellar. And then jewelry really lends itself well to like pieces that have a lot of detail, I think as well. So it's interesting to see you use like all of your technique and your expression in the paperweights, but then also put that on the body as well in kind of a wearable format.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I made the dragonfly body, on the blue part, it's actually a really dark blue. I actually used 24 karat gold, which I don't normally do, but for the jewelry pieces, I thought it was a way to connect with what you were speaking about with, the jewelry element.
Absolutely. And in glass working, and especially in flame working, there's such a rich history of jewelry making, and especially bead making, that just goes back through the centuries. So, I mean, that's what I think of, even though these aren't beads per se, that language is there, and that relationship to the fine jewelry setting, and then the gemstones is also there as well for me.
Yeah.
And I have a background as a bead maker. That's how I first got into glass. And again, although I'm not doing the same thing as you, there are elements of crossover here. These are glass beads, oversized glass beads that are depictions of different types of pollen. Most of them are invasive species. But it's sort of like what, if you looked at pollen grains under a microscope, this is what you would see. So in a way, there's a lot of elements that are very similar in what you're doing with your paperweight making. You're observing nature, changing the scale, rendering as closely realistic as you can those objects, and then representing them in this material of glass, which the material of glass really serves to extend the timeline of nature so that we can experience it as humans on a different, we can think with it for longer. We can be with it in a different type of way than we can in its original format in nature.
Yeah, these are, I find these really, really interesting. Now, are they silvered on the inside?
They are, yes. Yes.
Yeah. And it's all the colors are in the glass itself.
Correct, yes. So they're sculpted with transparent borosilicate glass.
Yeah.
And they're all hand sculpted except for the one like right in the center, that the aqua colored one, that was blown into a potato lomo. And that's what like it was kind of charcoal, and that's what makes all the texture. But all the rest of them are hand sculpted. Yeah, and then they're mirrorized. So I'm like you. I'm also tapping into the history of technique of flame working and of glass working. So if you know glass on that level, then you could tease out some more meaning here. Like these use a similar process of the history of making like Christmas ornaments. Silver Christmas ornaments with the blow mold, and then mirroring the inside, which there's a whole history and vocabulary that kind of emerged from that tradition. So I like to put those little touches in my work for the the glassy audience, but to find something, but then also to kind of teach my my viewers as well, if they want to do a deep dive into material culture, there's something to find there. And I also I see that in your work as well. It's a very sophisticated use of the material.
Yeah.
And
Gordon was talking about, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Alex.
Gordon was talking about using kind of precious materials and thinking about like the history of jewelry and kind of value. And I know that your work connects to bead making, not just from kind of history of glass beads, but beads as like a form of currency and kind of a tool for commerce. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I view beads are a format that comes up like throughout the history of my creative practice in a bunch of different ways. But at the core of it, I really think these objects and beads like really kind of transcend like culture and geography and all of these like limitations that we can kind of like make for ourselves as humans. And like, I see a bead as being a unit of cultural worth from whatever culture you represent. And they move around the world in that way too, and always have. And so, yeah, they're just so potent. And for me, like using beads, I use them not only in my sculpture and in my art practice and to make jewelry, but I also use them as my own form of currency as well, and circulate and trade them for goods and services that I, need or want. When I made the decision to become an artist early on, I don't know, 25 years ago or so, just I was in art school and I was just, kind of joking with my friends. I remember being like, oh boy, I'm going to choose this vocation as an artist. It's probably going to be a rough road. If only I could print my own money, I'd be like, good, And so the beads for me have like sort of become that in a lot of ways. And they've allowed me to participate in commerce in a lot of different ways, not just with like, trading my beads for money, but also trading for other things. And it really makes you think about what value is and about like how it's always fluctuating, even the dollar, against all the other currencies. Nothing is really static. It's always like you and I agree on a value, and that's what value is. So I like to be reminded of that in my practice, and that's one of the reasons why I make these.
Yeah, it's true with my work as well. I've actually done that. I've traded for a car.
Oh, that's a good one.
I've traded for medical service.
Yeah.
So it has value. It's interesting how money as we know it, it disappears when two people have a common interest in something and they can come together that way. It really does make you think about what we do. It's money goes away. It's not part of it if you don't want it to be.
Well, money's just an abstract representation of value.
Yeah.
So I mean, we could just get rid of that and just get straight to supply and demand,
Mm-hmm.
So I like to kind of think of it like that. But there's no reason why you can't make your own rules when it comes to commerce. You can choose to participate in a particular commerce system, but there's many different levels to that. And the barter system has always been a way that people have gotten what they need and gotten, shared access and shared value and made value, so I think we're still doing that as artists always. Yeah. I did, while we were kind of still talking about paperweights a little bit, I did want to share this piece. Is a little bit fringy, but I think it kind of fits in here. This is a piece called Family Tree that I made during my fellowship at Wheaton in 2015. And at that fellowship, I tried to use materials that were given to me, or I traded or like oral histories for materials. So a lot of the materials I used were found. And this particular glass was given to me. It had made its way to me from a paperweight maker who had retired. He had aged out because his eyesight, was declining. And so he had retired. And I ended up with a large amount of his glass, and I made this piece with it. And this piece is about passing on traditions from one generation to another, which at the time was something I was like really making a lot of work about. And so this piece, I had found part of a tree that had like come down on the Wheaton property, and I cut off all the branches and wove it all together into this like 3-dimensional form, and I stuck the glass in it, and then I fired it in the kiln. And so you can see where all the glass, this is like flame working rod. You can see it, right? That language is there. But the way that the rods are all kind of intertwined is not something that, like, how would you make that? There's some other force here that you can kind of see a little bit in the form of charcoal, but that previous generation, which for me, that's what the tree was symbolizing, has burned away and left the imprint on the glass that carried it forward to the next generation. So in a way, this is using paperweight making material and talking about using the language of flame working in the form of raw glass rods to talk about generational shifts and how knowledge gets passed on without actually making a paperweight.
Now,
go ahead.
Did you sit at a torch to make this?
No, it happened in the kiln. So, yep. Okay. Yep, this all happened in the kiln. So I have a whole other body of work that uses like materials that are manufactured for flame working, like glass rods. That's typically what that shape of glass would be, used for as a raw material. And it's recognizable as that. But I like to kind of do something unexpected with it, or, like this series for a while, I called it Other Possible Outcome. It's like, well, what else could I use this for? What other possibilities are there that this form could make its way into? I also have a background in painting. That's where my traditional education is. And so another thing that pops up is that I really think that starting with a long straight glass rod and then bending it either in the kiln or in the flame is a lot like painting or squeezing glass out from a tube. And so there's a little bit of painting language, I think, in here as well. In Pasto, this like thick kind of paint that doesn't even need a canvas. It's like moved beyond the canvas kind of into like sharing the same space as me, which I've always wanted paint to do, but it wouldn't. So glass can do that though. Yeah. All right, so the last kind of little section here of your work that I would love to hear a little bit more about is this suite of commission pieces for the artist Max Superschneider, which are plasma pieces. Could you tell us about these, and then we'll do kind of like a walkthrough of the process?
Yeah, they're I think you have some slides that'll show how big they are. They're pretty big. And what happened, this was another case where Max is not a glass artist, but he wanted his ideas to be represented this way. And so he commissioned us to make the pieces for him. And he sent the company sculptures of what you see in the egg. And there you can see them on the left-hand side there. I did 12 of them. And so that's what I got. And then I set out to just working with pieces of tubing to recreate these images and then encase them, or not encase them, but seal them into the large eggs, which one of the guys that I worked with, Bill Wenzel, he made the eggs and did the final, he sealed them in. But what I did was I just stood and worked freehand, sculpting what was in there, and then silvered them. And then you can see here, I'm holding the finished egg, and then plasma was introduced to them, and they were, all the electric was done, and the finished pieces were presented. And what they are, Max's idea here was he wanted to give his interpretation of what a future society, what the embryos of a future society would look like. And that's what these are to represent.
I love that. And I feel like this is sort of like the perfect piece to kind of end on in a way, because it really merges the technologies that that you're so like practiced at, like with coming from the scientific glassblowing background, and then also an artistic sensibility. And I do fabrication for the fine arts world as well, and that's how I learned how to flame work. Is making work for, if people send you a weird napkin drawing or a 3D rendering or whatever, then your job is to like make it come to life, and then the glass happens in the service of the concept of the artwork. So I really like how this is a blend of both of those sensibilities. And then the forms are just kind of wild in there too. This is some really cool plasma. So
yeah. Forms came out really well. The plasma worked out really well. It was a great project. It was fun to work on. It was nice to do freehand work like that. And it's kind of like what I see the hot shop guys do a lot of stuff on the end of a blowpipe, and I was just doing it on the end of a piece of tubing, basically performing the same sculpting abilities, just but in flame working.
Totally. I would love, like, I really wanted to include these pieces in here because I teach plasma design at Salem Community College, and it's a new program. We're in our second year, and we have a whole new crop of plasma artists that are now kind of coming out of Salem Community College. And so we want to give them some examples of something to kind of shoot for, right? And this is excellent work to share with that community. And then also on another note, WheatonArts for the fellowship, you all just upgraded your facilities, and now neon and plasma are possible over there for the fellowship. So that's very exciting. And I think the more we can kind of educate the glass community and the art community and New Jersey community about plasma, the more kind of welcome it'll be when artists coming out of Salem and coming out of Wheaton with this work, there'll be an audience here to appreciate and understand it and be interested in how it was made. So, yeah.
Well, and Amy, you and your students were instrumental in setting that up. It was very, Amy came down to Wheaton with a class full of students and took our manifold and serviced it back at Salem. There's a real kind of collaboration happening in this realm. I did want to ask, can you talk about technically, like, what is plasma? What is happening there? What's the difference between this and neon and other glass that lights up?
The Cliff Notes version on that, plasma is the fourth state of matter, right? So you have liquid, solid, gas, and then plasma is excited gas that's conductive. And so you're able to see it kind of hold an electric charge, right? And it emits light. So that's the visual effect that we see. And plasma is produced by, in this case, we have a glass vessel that's been evacuated, and then the interior space has been replaced with a combination of different kinds of noble gas. And then that has the capacity to, when you electrify it with a transformer, produce plasma effects, light effects. So you've probably seen neon. The terminology can get confusing because neon is like an art form and it's also a gas, a noble gas. So our neon is an example in the middle here, the orange. That would be like what the noble gas neon produces. But when we talk about plasma, my best understanding of how I would differentiate plasma from neon as far as formats go is plasma takes advantage of this capacitive field that has free energy, right? And so you think of a plasma globe as like lightning in a bottle, and the lightning is kind of like moving around, right? And it's moving around because it's searching for ground. And neon, traditional neon, has two electrodes on it, and so the current just goes from one end to the other. It doesn't. There are some exceptions to all of this, but for the Cliff Notes version, the plasma has a lot more movement because there's just one point where the power is coming in, and then this capacitive field. And there's a lot that you can really do from a design standpoint to take advantage of that. So here in these pieces, the center form there, those amoeba forms, are basically an extension of the electrode. So there's two chambers in here, and there'll be an electrode connected to the bottom of that black tube there, and that's where the power is coming in. And then this outer egg shape doesn't have any power connected to it. That just has the plasma gas in it at a high pressure. And so when it gets into contact with that capacitive field, that's when the magic happens. Yeah, it's pretty exciting. And down at Salem, what we're doing with our plasma design class, it's in the context of the Scientific Glass Technologies program, which is the program we graduated from, to go work in the scientific industry. And so we have excellent glass blowers here who can make any kind of form. And so we not only have the students design, fabricate, and fill their own plasma pieces, but they also designed and built the manifold that we use, which is the tool, the apparatus that we use to actually evacuate the tubes and then fill it with noble gas. So we're designing and building manifolds and maintaining both ours and the manifold at Wheaton, and trying to teach the students as much as we can about running a studio, keeping the equipment in good working order, and using it. So hopefully they will expand the field. That's the hope. So we'll see. And on that note, I have one piece of my plasma work, which the plasma is not that spectacular, but I think the concept fits really well here. This piece is called Synapse, and for me, it's about the currency of education, right? And so this piece runs on this, if you look at the image on the left, there's like this black box on the left-hand side. That's a proximity sensor. So the piece stays dormant until the viewer comes by. And when you walk up to it, that sensor senses the viewer and it turns the plasma on, kind of in recognition, right? And for me, I am an educator. I work in group studios. I get a lot of inspiration from being around other people who are transmitting knowledge to each other, kind of like that aha moment when you realize something. To me, that's what the plasma is. It's the synapse, and it's contagious and it's inspirational. And that's why I choose to work in education and choose to work in schools and choose to make work about education. So I thought this would be a good piece to end on. It has those pollen pieces in there as well that you saw in the other image. And for me, pollen represents not only connection to the natural world, but also this idea of spreading ideas and kind of cross-pollinating and making something new and spreading ideas out in a way that's beyond what one person can do. So on that note, I think we're kind of starting to come to the end of our program here. So I just wanted to kind of put this slide up and just let our audience know that both Gordon and I are both on Instagram, and you can follow what we're doing in the studio through our Instagram accounts. And please keep in touch with us all.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any questions? I haven't been looking at the chat, but are there any questions that have popped up? I'm going to go back to regular format here so I can see everybody.
I think if anybody does want to ask a question, you're welcome to enter it into the Q&A. I have one while we see if anybody has a burning desire before we wrap things up. I was just, Amy, looking at the work that you showed that you had made during your residency, I was just thinking about how long glass lasts. Mm-hmm. And this kind of, throughout the talk, Gordon, we were talking about, kind of preserving this kind of minuscule moment in a paperweight. And we were talking about these objects of value like heirlooms. And I was thinking about this moment of this person whose material outlived his career, kind of giving the material onto you. And then thinking about glass like existing on this kind of geologic timescale, like lasts longer than our lives, maybe longer than humanity itself. So, what is it that drives you to make this work that kind of exists, kind of the ultimate archival material?
Well, for me, like just when I was listening to you speak just now, I'm reminded of like something that happened earlier on in my career where, I went to school for painting and visual arts and kind of a traditional like American semiotic art school education, which is not archival, that isn't really like the goal there, of expression. And so when I started making glass beads was the first time I had any kind of like interaction with glass as a material when I was 19. And the first beads that I made at my first workshop, I just kind of got this flash of like, this is bigger than me. These are going to outlast me. And not only that, but they connect to, all of the glass and the beads that had been made before, during, and after my lifetime. And it just felt so powerful. And to tap into something like that, it just seemed like something I wanted to investigate deeper. And then another thing is like, especially with the bead forms, this is another thing I kind of think about as I've like gone through my life this far, is I like this idea of like leaving beads in my wake. I'm traveling around the world and going through my life as people do. And I like to think of it as kind of like leaving a little trail of popcorn, but minor beads, and they're glass, and those will be there like long after I've stepped on the earth, and I like that it leaves like physical footprints in a way of my life here on earth. So that's kind of how I think of my relationship to that material. And now moving into sculptural format, like larger scale sculptural format, they're a little less portable, but the idea is still the same. I guess the gestures are just a little bit bigger, maybe. But yeah.
We do have one question that popped into the chat from Ruth. thank you for this program. Are there many companies that create handmade glass vessels for scientific uses? Maybe Gordon or either of you can talk about that a little bit.
Gordon.
There are. I think there's fewer in America than there used to be, but there's a number of places that things are that are made. A lot of things are made in China now, India now, but there are a lot of American companies still making things.
And one from like my perspective, working down here at Salem Community College, we're the only school in the country that has a scientific glassblowing program. And so any student who comes through here and wants a job, there are plenty of jobs to be had. We can't train people fast enough to fill the jobs in the industry. So scientific glassblowing is something that's very much a contemporary vocation still. And one of the things that that I've heard about recently is, with the coronavirus and all the vaccine research that's been done, right? The vaccine research needs glassware, and then all of the ampules and everything need to be made. But any kind of research fuels other types of research. So the vaccine research that's getting funded is also like kind of fueling all this other research across the board where there's glassware needed. So
Yeah.
down here in Jersey, it's like our students are just, soon as they can flame work, they're just off to work, at the scientific facilities. Or there are a number of facilities that make like prep parts that then a glass blower would take all those, like, say, valves and flasks and stuff and seal them all together to make a more complex apparatus. So there's like many different levels to the supply chain.
Yeah, there's also one thing that a lot of people don't think about. As we evolved technologically, the semiconductor world, if you don't have glass blowers making, there are specific pieces of apparatus that are used that is part of the semiconductor process. And if you don't have them, you don't have semiconductors. So there's that whole part that's going to be ongoing. And as that evolves, these pieces of glass, like Amy just spoke to, it'll evolve into different things, because there's the next breakthrough and the next breakthrough and the next breakthrough. There's another piece of glass that's needed, and machines can't do them all. So machines can do some things, but there's always going to be the pair of hands and the glass blower out there that's needed for these things. The CBD industry, the hemp industry, that was huge for the last 10 years. A lot of companies thrived because of that new industry, and glass blowers were at the heart of it. Mm-hmm. So it's always there.
And even as far as maintaining existing glass blowing in the world, who's going to fix glassware when it breaks and you need to have it repaired? The vocation of scientific glassblower, it's not something that everyone you might think of right away as a vocation, but it's actually really important. And a lot of what happens is behind the scenes, supporting researchers in other ways.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's one of the local industries in South Jersey, mm-hmm. which has a very rich glassblowing history, and I'm proud to say that scientific glassblowing is a big part of it. Even towns like Millville and Vineland and Glassboro has glass right in the name. So such a rich history here.
That was part of it. I mean, it was in the world back in the 50s and 60s. It was Vineland and Millville. In southern New Jersey, they were the mecca for laboratory glass in the world, not just but in the world. And a lot of the buildings are still there.
Yep. And Wheaton's right in the middle of all that. So, like, what a great location to really kind of think about all these things and be a part of it, and go over there to be a maker.
Yeah, and they had a scientific company. Wheaton Scientific was a business, along with their bottle blowing and all the other things they did.
Well, it's so interesting to hear your perspective, Gordon, because I really feel like you're in your career and in your life so far, like you really kind of embody like a lot of these different things that we've talked about, like being an artist, being like a scientific glassblower, and being like a native to New Jersey, and then also incorporating in like the seashore and like, you know, some of the your life lived there. And it's just so cool how you've been able to kind of like have it all culminate in these like glass objects that, you know, are going to, that have the ability to like expand beyond like your experience on Earth. And yeah.
Well, I'm happy to be able to share it with you, and thank you. Thank you for having me again and facilitating. You've been great.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been great to learn more about your practice and about your life.
Yeah, well, I'm going to learn about yours now, because I'm going to get out to Salem and see what you're up to out there.
Totally.
So,
Sounds good.
Well, thank you all for joining. This was a really great conversation, and Gordon and Amy, I know both of your work fairly well, but I learned new things, so I'm always happy to learn new things about the people that I follow.
yeah.
See.
Well, I just want to say thanks, Alex and Pam, for co-hosting,
Absolutely.
and for this
Alex,
opportunity.
do you have any other questions, or do you have any other questions, Alex, before we close out tonight?
I think that wraps it up. I do want to thank the two of you again for taking the time to talk to us and our community, and I hope to see you soon in the studio.
Yeah. Great.
Absolutely. Well, and thank you to our audience for joining us. We have Wheaton Conversations continuing, so please be sure to register for our next Wheaton Conversation. We will be inviting James Akers and Jacob Wilcox, and they will join us on October 20th. This recording that I'm doing this evening will be posted on our YouTube channel, and at that location you can also watch past conversations, so please do check that out. Thank you again for joining us. You can learn more at WheatonArts.org, and if you have questions, comments, you can email me at pweichman@WheatonArts.org. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.